Oh, hey there, scary story fanatics. Welcome back to Cleaving Thought from Bone with your host, Sociopathic. Are you famished for more fear? I know I sure am. So, grab a snack, no matter how fast it runs, and get ready for your fill of the good stuff. Delway's Meathouse Diner.
Working construction is a pretty good gig, especially if you're like me, a free soul untethered by attachments, not having to carry too much responsibility. The pay is good, particularly for a single guy in his 20s. My wages more than pay my rent and other bills, leaving me with a considerable surplus of money at the end of each week, usually in the form of a couple $100 bills. Hell, I don't even have a car payment each month. I buy my vehicles outright, used, usually out of the paper or off Craigslist. It is an arena in which buyers need to beware, but I'm well versed in automobiles, having been a whiz in my auto shop back in high school. Not to say used vehicles don't need a little more love, but I can usually take care of any issues myself. Usually. Every Friday night, my buddies and I either hit the local bar or some backwoods party in someone's house, apartment. Hell, we've even had keggers in the woods. It might not sound like that much fun, but when the guy-girl ratio is actually pretty decent, and everyone is running around in nothing but togas by the light of a campfire, one can make some pretty good memories out here in the middle of Redneckville nowhere. By the time I got home on Friday, I was ready to cut loose. My best friend, Pete Stone, everyone called him Stoney, had hit me up with a text on Wednesday, divulging the details of a killer party to take place Friday night. Apparently, the rendezvous for the festivities was out in the sticks. I inquired as to the specifics of the location, but Stoney replied with a series of left and right turn descriptions, naming landmarks I had never even heard of before, having me turned around in my head before we had even started. I was in the middle of texting him back when he told me not to worry about it, that we'd be riding in together anyway, and that he knew the way there like the back of his hand. I'd never heard of the Devil's Punch Bowl before, but apparently he'd been there a few times before we'd met. By the time Stoney and I had arrived, by means of my high-mileage SUV, the sky had already gone from blue to an orange and pink, to a shade of ever-darkening purple. The poor lighting didn't do much to hinder the look of the place, because it appeared exactly as Stoney described, minus the abundance of parked, unoccupied vehicles that would have been better suited for a Burger King parking lot. We weren't the last to arrive, but we certainly weren't the first either. Adjacent the large, gravelly area sat a lake so tranquil it could have easily doubled as a large sheet of glass that reflected the starlight from the sky above and the faces of the cliffs that lined the back side of it. Stoney had told me some local myths about the place on the way here: an entrance to hell, a train lost at the bottom of the lake, forever entombing those who had drowned in the train wreck years ago. It was good for a laugh, but I never did take too much of the supernatural stuff seriously. I sure as hell do now, but at the time, I was focused on having a good time and having a few too many drinks and a few good laughs and possibly hooking up, depending on who showed. Eager to begin the night, Stoney and I climbed from our seats, grabbed the beer I had bought on the way there, and made our way towards a crowd of people, carrying on and laughing beside a roaring bonfire. I got trashed pretty quickly. Some of our new friends happened to bring a half keg, and when I was asked to do a keg stand, I was more than obliged. Several of those, 6 Jello shots, and 2 bottled Molsons later, I was feeling pretty great. The fun raged on until about midnight, before diminishing into quiet smiles, admiring the dwindling fire, and the random couple happily lost in each other, making out somewhere close by in the darkness. It's hard to say when the night of debauchery had transformed into one of relaxation and fraternizing, but the good times and relaxation was cut short by the grumbling of black clouds in the distance, bringing with it the promise of one hell of a rainstorm. Without shelter in the middle of the woods, the party-goers began heading for their respective vehicles. Stoney, however, was headed in the wrong direction, towards another vehicle. When I asked what his plans were, he informed me that he was going to take a lift from some girl that he had just met, hoping to get lucky. He asked me if I'd be okay to make it back on my own. I lied when I told him I could. Not only was I pretty darn drunk, but the twisty roads and dirt paths we had followed left me pretty perplexed as to how to get home. I knew that if I could get back to the town of Susquehanna, that I'd be okay. I frequented quite a few parties in that quaint little town, and I knew it well. I knew we were only a few miles from it, and I pride myself on being the best wingman ever, so I decided to take the risk of getting lost. It began with one vehicle pulling out and leaving the gravel lot in taillights, then another, then two more, until by the time I had sobered up enough to drive, I noticed I was the last car in the lot. That's when I started to get antsy about my own departure. I probably should have stayed where I was for the night, having drank as much as I did, but I knew I was capable of traversing nearly the vacant, isolated roads back home. Out here in this neck of the woods, there aren't too many cops, so as long as I didn't swerve or speed, coupled with the fact that I had waited a bit, the chances I'd be pulled over and or charged were pretty slim. Unfortunately, I had waited so long that by the time I had pulled from place, the rain was coming down in sight-obstructing sheets. Sure, it could have been the alcohol, or my unfamiliarity with the desolate back roads, or a simple lapse in attention, but nothing was looking familiar, and I mostly attribute this to the poor visibility that accompanied the storm. I had made a few turns before I had decided that I must have headed the wrong way, having driven too far not to come across the Susquehanna town limits, and turned back the direction I had come. Maybe I had missed a previous turn I had taken, or maybe I had just traveled out so far, but the world outside the car had become so alien. I spent the better part of 30 minutes changing my mind and making turns and course corrections, trying to locate any landmark I may recognize. Of course, I was now thoroughly lost, somewhere on the back roads in the wilderness of eastern Pennsylvania, not having a gas station or house light in sight. And as if life intentionally played a cruel joke on me at the most inopportune of times, the check engine light flashed on the SUV's dashboard moments before the vehicle lost power, headlights, power steering, and all, shutting itself off, forcing me to coast to the side of the road and come to a complete stop. "Fuck!" I yelled out, to no one in particular, venting my frustration over the terrible luck that now seemingly left me in a desperate situation. I turned the key a few times, hoping the engine may spark back into life, providing me with a means to get home and release me from the bonds that come with being stranded. I found myself disheartened. The engine showed no signs that it would concede to my demands. The SUV was dead. I squinted my eyes and peered through the blurry, rain-soaked windows, probing the fuzzy darkness for any sign of life, distant life if need be. The darkness beyond the windshield yielded nothing. The side windows provided the same. But in my rearview mirror, nearly undetectable, a mere pinprick of light, partially concealed by the warping of light through rainwater, promised a beacon of hope some distance down the road, back the way I had been traveling. I didn't remember passing any homes or businesses in quite some time, but as dark as pitch as the night was, I suppose it could have been overlooked altogether as I drove by, my focus locked tight on the blurry road lines beyond my windshield. I grabbed my door handle, paused for a moment at the thought of getting drenched, and with one momentous shove of will, I opened the car door, shut it with haste, and began jogging in the direction of the lights. Twangy, folky, country music played on a colorful jukebox in the corner as a result of what I assumed to be random selection. The walls were covered in a vintage wallpaper, and I marveled at how well it had been maintained. Even the retro-style booths and tables seemed almost new, and I couldn't help but admire the rustic and nostalgic value this out-of-the-way place seemed to simultaneously own. I hadn't seen anyone move in the direction of the music machine since I had arrived, and I didn't take the few lingering patrons as the ones who cared what tune was sang in the background as they sipped at their coffees and devoured whatever dish they had ordered. In actuality, I didn't see any of them move, or should I say, either of them, as there had only been 2 patrons in the establishment when I had come running in through the doors, alcohol on my breath, searching for a place to get dry and maybe use a phone. Some of you may be asking, why not use the cell phone? But for those of you who have been to the Susquehanna area of the Appalachian mountain range, will attest that cell service is limited at best. Neither of the customers, both older gentlemen, seemed to even notice me as they paid me no attention. An older woman, seemingly in her 40s with dirty blonde hair, a white smock with the diner's logo, and an over-enthusiastic and helpful demeanor, asked if I needed any help after commenting on my drowned rat appearance, whilst filling the coffee mug of one of the older gentlemen sitting at a booth by himself. I had eyed the large neon sign in the parking lot as I had passed by it, which had been the light that I had seen from my car, now a distance away. Delway's Diner, Last Chance Burger, glowed and flickered on a large, solid post. The reds and blues from the lights, hazy and difficult to focus on due to the wisping and beating of rainfall. I must have been really lost, because I've never even heard of this place before. I know the area pretty well, so either the Last Chance Burger sub-label made no sense, as there were 3 McDonald's in town, or I had driven so far away from my desired destination that this backwoods mom-and-pop diner really did make the last burger for miles. Margot, as she introduced herself, was co-owner of the establishment and more than happy to seat me at an empty booth. She told me that her husband was the cook and that he made the finest burger in 3 neighboring states, if I fancied something to eat, as she put it. I just really wanted to use a phone, but she told me that the line had recently gone out. Probably because of the sudden storm, I assured myself in the privacy of my own thoughts. I decided waiting out the storm here was at least preferable to walking back out and sitting in a non-functional SUV. Damn piece of shit, I scoffed internally. Resigned to waiting out the rain or for the phone to be working again, whichever came first, I decided on a hot cup of coffee to warm my chilled and rain-soaked bones, and one of those legendary burgers the chef's wife had bragged about so enthusiastically. The coffee wasn't bad, maybe slightly burnt, but was well complemented by the house's burger. Margot was right. The meat was soft, the bun was fluffy, and the whole experience made it seem as though I had never had a proper hamburger until that exact meal. It was so good, it almost made the inconvenience of breaking down on the side of the road after a night of debauchery almost worth it. The great thing about the state of Pennsylvania is that some bars and restaurants, especially those located in the middle of nowhere, still allow you to smoke. And upon seeing the ashtray on the inside of the booth when I had first been seated, signaled to me that it was okay for me to pull the pack of menthols that I had in my coat out of my pocket and light one up. I inhaled deeply, enjoying the satisfaction of the meal that I had just had. I once again noticed that the two gentlemen had not moved from their seats, not looked up from their plates, or even made a sound since I had first noticed them. Now that I was watching them, I realized that they were barely eating, only pushing and moving small bits of food about their plate before bringing the utensils to their mouths, presenting little, if any, actual food. Odd, I thought to myself. I signaled for Margot to refill my coffee. She disappeared into the back and retrieved the pot. As I waited, I became aware of a stinging sensation in my bladder, demanding I pay a visit to the men's room. Standing to my feet, I eyed the sitting area for a restroom sign and found one in the back corner adjacent to where I was sitting. I first noticed the sensation with my first few steps towards the bathroom, but the effect was so minimal I paid it little mind, attributing the feeling to fatigue or lingering inebriation. But once I had been standing at the urinal and the room began to dip and swirl, I knew that something was wrong. I zipped myself and stumbled towards the bathroom mirror. I didn't make it. The lights dimmed and the room went black before I had even hit the floor. It was the smell that I noticed first. The thick aromas of cooking meat and simmering vegetables wafted through the air until creeping into my nostrils. I think I thought I was in my home, my mother's home. She was cooking venison stew bubbling on the stove, the smell of which would invade the entire house because when I opened my eyes, I at first found myself befuddled. I was greeted with the sight of grease-stained walls and countertops covered in a dark substance, but these images greeted my eyes in blurry splotches of beiges and dark browns, with an encompassing border of blackness. Whatever my body was under the influence of, it was stronger than alcohol, and numbed most of my senses, obstructing the cohesion of thoughts that would render the dire situation that I now faced clear. I struggled to recall the events that led to this discorporated state of being, and when I went to rub my eyes, I found my arms restrained. I pulled at my bonds again. They gripped me tight, and I was unable to move. Adrenaline began to course through my veins as dread began to wash over me, and that's when I heard the twangy country music playing softly in my ears. Realization brought with it only fear and panic, which must have helped me focus my vision and clear my lethargy, because my wide eyes scanned my surroundings with an ever-increasing accuracy and capability for detail. I recognized the vintage motif, but this was not the large front room filled with booths and tables. I must have been in the kitchen, because the southern drawl of the country singer was softened by the large double doors to my left, the jukebox playing on the other side. Mental clarity now regained, I returned my attention to whatever was keeping me sitting in this position and redoubled my efforts on breaking free from the wooden chair to which I discovered myself bound. The seat creaked and moaned as I fought at the thick rope and polished wood of the chair, and complain as it did, it would not yield or break. "Hey! What the fuck's going on?" I yelled out in fluster, unsure whether or not I wanted someone to hear me. I heard the sound of water connecting with something hot, identified by the telltale hiss. I slowly lifted my head and turned to the right, in the direction of the noise. And I think it was shock that stifled my vomit. For if I had not been at first perplexed at the myriad of dark colors and chunks of soft, uncooked flesh, and then taken so far aback by it that my mind tried desperately to refuse what it was perceiving, I likely would have thrown up all over myself in that chair. Meat that was unidentifiable as one animal or another laid upon a countertop in large, red chunks, so fresh and recently cleaved from whatever animal it belonged to. The uncoagulated blood oozed almost black as it leaked from the surface of the pile of chunks and strips of flesh, pooling onto the top of a large, soiled countertop before rolling off the edge in multiple places, oozing to the floor below. The wall behind these fleshy masses was decorated in a plethora of carving utensils, both large and small, and between and behind them, crusted red and yellowish stains collected to the vinyl wallpaper in giant globs that nearly covered the beige color beneath, appearing as if something large and fleshy had exploded nearby, splattered onto the wall, and hadn't been cleaned for decades, now a permanent fixture. Above the macabre scene hung a plaque, slightly yellowed and dirtied with fingerprints and smudges. It read, "The best burgers are made with love." I recalled the delectable hamburger I had consumed earlier, and the thought that it had originated from the disgusting pile of hacked and bleeding flesh sitting in a pool of unkempt filth and slop made my stomach churn with repulsion. Vomit fought its way up my esophagus and into my mouth. I swallowed it back down with a grimace, still unwilling to empty my stomach contents all over my lap. I heard the hissing noise again, and my trance on the grotesque scene was broken. My stomach subsided. I twisted my head as far as I could, as much to the right now as the bonds would allow, and in the corner of my periphery, I could see a stove with a large metal soup pot bubbling on it, a white foam building up past the rim of the top before slipping from the side and landing on the burner below, causing those hissing noises. There was something else, something on the floor whose yellowish color stood out among the dark brown floor tiles, but I had reached up the pliability limits of my neck and was having trouble discerning what it was. I shook back and forth violently, trying to turn the chair an inch or two to the side, allowing me to gain the vantage point I desired, but in the end, I only succeeded in tipping too far to one side and tumbling over onto my right shoulder. I winced on impact, but when I reopened my eyes, I realized that with the way I had landed, my position allowed me the sight of the object I so desperately attempted to behold. The human body is an incredible thing. Mothers can lift entire vehicles from trapped children. An insane person is said to have the strength of 10 men. Under duress, we're capable of incredible feats of strength. Laying cheek down in a cool, slick pool of thick crimson blood and bits of gore, and realizing the thing on the floor to be the remnants of what was left of a human hand and scaphoid, I found my superhuman strength from within me and wrenched at the ropes that held me in place on that foul, sticky floor, stuck in a gruesome scene of writhing and struggling in the slippery crimson, like a maggot restrained and impaled. Maybe my physically demanding career helped, or maybe the chair was in fact much older than it looked, but after only a few minutes of thrashing, trying to shake loose my bonds, I heard a creaking crack. Renewed with the smallest sense of hope, I pulled harder, and just when I thought the veins behind my eyes would push them from their sockets, there was a loud pop of splintering wood, and the chair to which I was tied broke where my right wrist was tied tightly. From there, I was easily able to untie the rest of my limbs and free myself entirely. I climbed to my feet, eager to abscond. I nearly slipped in the greasy red slime beneath my feet, but I managed to hold my footing. The smell of the air was sickening, thick with the taste of copper and blood. Basically in flight mode now, I nearly overlooked the sight that had been kept from my line of vision, behind the chair. I had imagined the smell and taste of blood and death had come from the gore and foulness I had already visually imbibed. But I realized I was likely wrong in that assumption when I spied the heap on the floor. A foul mass, half the size of a refrigerator, comprised of necrotic black flesh and crusted with blood, was piled on the floor by the back door, and I had not seen it until now. It looked as haphazard as it did grotesque and repulsive, as if someone had discarded the parts unfit for soups, burgers, and other meals and simply tossed those bits aside, allowing them to fester and rot unabated, now crowned with a thick layer of white moss that both clumped together in patches and dangled in long strands of white hair-like fibers. I lost it, tossing my stomach contents where I stood, and I began running for the swinging double door that led to the restaurant area, still vomiting as I did. I didn't even bother to check what was in those boiling pots. And I didn't really want to either, afraid of what I might discover. The restaurant was now vacant, not a single soul in sight. I paused only for a moment until I heard the sound of a distant door shutting and footsteps approaching soon after. I tore ass to the door and threw it. The rain hadn't let up at all since I had gone inside, and the night was still pitch as ever. Realizing any direction was as good as the next, I chose right and began tearing ass down the road towards my disabled vehicle. Not more than a few hundred yards down the wet pavement, the glare of headlights graced my back, causing my shadow to stretch out long in front of me. I turned once to spy a pair of lights, cutting through the dark like menacing eyes. Whoever it was had surely seen me. But that didn't matter. I was going to try and hide anyway. Run for it if I had to. In that moment, I knew it was my captors, ready to take me back into that kitchen from hell and do God knows what to me. But when I changed trajectory and ran towards the tree line on the other side of the road, I realized the bright white lights had changed to that of alternating red and blue. My heart leaped, hoping upon hope that my assumptions were correct, and when I turned around to see that it was indeed a police cruiser that was approaching me, I nearly passed out from relief and jumped for joy at the same time. But I did neither. I stood in place, hoping the rescuer was indeed genuine, but ready to bolt for the forest at the first sign of trouble. The cruiser pulled up beside me, and the passenger window rolled down.
Where you headed?
The people at that diner. They took me. There's pieces of corpses everywhere. They're eating people, I exclaimed in panic. Of course, the officer had trouble discerning what it was exactly that I was saying, but after a few minutes, he had convinced me of his intentions and had me in the back seat of his car. I explained all that had happened, and when I mentioned Delway's diner, the cop went silent. I figured he thought I was insane. I watched out the window as the cop pulled a U-turn in the road and headed back the way he came. When he pulled the vehicle into a dark, deserted parking lot, I at first found myself confused.
Is this the place?
He asked. The scenery outside wasn't just enveloped in the darkest of nights, but also blurred and warped due to the accumulation of rainwater on the glass. When I first peered out the window, I saw nothing at all, just black. But as my eyes adjusted, I began to see the silhouettes of shapes. A billboard-like sign, weathered and aged, long since disused, and a large, box-like shape behind it. It looked nothing like Delway's. No, I stated plainly. The cop then turned on his searchlight and pointed it at the sign. My mind fought so hard against what it was seeing, I nearly convinced myself that I must have been dreaming or something. But I know I didn't dream all that. I felt it. Still, the old, weather-beaten sign, spelling out the words, Delway's Diner, Last Chance Burger, begged to differ with my logical reasoning. It couldn't be. This was Delway's, but it was different now. Different than it was only minutes beforehand. I tried to speak a few times, but no words came out. The cop then stepped from his cruiser, locking me inside and heading towards the front door, shining his light in the windows of the old, closed establishment. After a few minutes, he came back to my door, opened it, and coaxed me into following him. I reluctantly agreed, now terrified at the thought of that place. But when I got there and looked inside, I saw what he was getting at. The paper was now peeling from where it had once been glued, the tables old, some broken, all worn. The seats now cracked and torn in places. The floor was warped, heaving like the soft ripple of the ocean's surface. It wasn't like this before. It wasn't like this. The cop said nothing, but reassured me somehow with his expression. Like, in some way, he understood. Maybe even believed me. Escorting me back to the vehicle, he placed me safely back inside and got into the driver's seat, offering to take me home. I eagerly agreed, just wanting this night to be over, and off down that silent, rain-soaked country road we went. Turns out, I wasn't all that far from Susquehanna after all, maybe only 15 miles on the outskirts, but turned around on some roads that I had never traversed before. He had been so silent for so many minutes, I was genuinely startled when the cop spoke up from the front seat.
I believe you,
he said out of the blue at first. I managed a, huh? But it was so soft, I don't even think he heard me.
I grew up around here. Started and raised my family here. Lived here my whole life. Your story sounds disturbingly familiar to some rumors I grew up with around here. And later, once I joined the force, discovered to be true. You see, back in the late 1960s, an older couple by the names of Margot and Edwin Delway owned that little diner back there. Business was good for a while, and the small community practically revered them as family, like mother and father to an entire small-town population. Well, this is a railroad town, and once the new highway was built, construction and habitation migrated with it, but the Delways did not, for one reason or another. Maybe they just liked the area, but they didn't move sharp. This in turn impacted their business severely, and after a while, most people forgot that little diner was even back there at all. As the township grew, so did town businesses, and the increased tourism that comes with highway traffic demanded a need for workers to man shops and businesses in the area. In short, there was a huge influx of traffic, people coming and going, and no one really noticed the disappearances for a while. It was a hot day in 1969 when a man came into the station, apparently rambling on about that diner, almost incoherently. Taking what they could from him, the men on duty drove out there to question the old couple. They said the first thing they noticed was the stench. Behind the thick smell of grilled meat and fried eggs was something much more powerful and sickening to the senses. Upon entering the kitchen, they discovered the bodies of Mr. and Mrs. Delway, later learning that Edwin had killed his wife before taking his own life with the same blade. In the corner of that kitchen was reported to be a pile of scraps, human body parts unfit for cooking, deemed by the gruesome duo to be uneatable, and left to rot where they'd been tossed, causing the terrible stench of death that underscored the smell of cooking meat. Apparently, the man had, for one reason or another, discovered the gruesome scene and had fled for his life, pursued for a short while by one of his would-be killers. The cops assumed it was Edwin, and that he doubled back. Knowing the cops would shortly arrive, that they were surely doomed to death or imprisonment, he took a fillet knife, slit his wife's throat, and then slit his own in a murder-suicide. Those two maniacs at some point must have decided to try and save money by kidnapping and killing stray tourists that happened by, not likely to be missed, cutting costs on their main product overhead, meat. When I was in school, kids used to say that place was still haunted by that despicable couple, sometimes daring each other to enter. Nowadays, I think most have all but forgotten the place entirely. You'd do best to remember, these parts are heavy with the presence of things not natural of this earth.
He finished, as he pulled up alongside my driveway. Once he had gotten to my side of the car and opened the door to let me out of the back seat, I thanked him for his help, unsure of what to say about anything else. As I turned to walk up to my house, the motion light came on with a start, illuminating my appearance. I looked down at myself and noticed something astonishing. I was clean. I mean, I was soaking wet still, but there was no sign of any blood on my clothes. But that was impossible. I was lying in a pool of it. Maybe the rain washed it away, I thought. But that didn't seem quite possible either. I mean, a few laundry loads has a tough time getting out bloodstains. It seemed unlikely that rainwater would do the trick so easily. I turned once more to face the officer and offer one last thank you and good night. But when I did, something happened that I still have trouble coming to terms with to this day. The man raised his hand and smirked. Just before him and the police cruiser behind him, as if nothing had ever been there, slowly began to fade away until they had disappeared entirely into thin air.
Oh, well, not only am I full, I'm left with the question of what or who may be feigning actuality. But one thing you can be sure of is that there will be more filling fear right here next weekend. Until then, beware of apparitions and make sure to like, share, subscribe, and turn on notifications so I can catch you all next Saturday.